Welcome to From the Ground Up, now independently owned and produced by TechChange Unbrokered. For our first episode to kick it off, I want to welcome Joey, CEO of Emmett, to our podcast. And Joey, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Emmett and how it's shaping the steel industry?
Awesome. Thanks for having me on. Stoked to connect to talk about what we're building. Emmett's disrupting the steel distribution space. We refer to ourselves as a tech-enabled steel distributor, and we're largely changing the dynamics of how steel goes from the mill through distribution and onto the end user, the manufacturer, who will then take the steel and build whatever it is they're building, be a bridge, a pipeline, building, seismic braces, the list goes on and on.
So for our listeners, could you give us a little bit of a background? How did you actually enter the steel industry? It's not very common. We hear about steel, we hear about U.S. steel in the latest news, but it's seldom talked about. So can you explain a little bit more of how you got involved? And then tell us where Emmett fits in the steel supply chain.
Definitely. So I did not dream of working in the steel industry growing up. I did not wake up every morning and Google the steel industry, that's for sure. I had a buddy who was working at a steel distributor right out of college, and he was just kind of telling me some stories that sold some steel to SpaceX at the time. And I'm like, what? How? That sounds really cool. I want to go do that. Said, hey, if there's a sales job, let me know. Would love to try that out, see how it works. And a few weeks later, I was working at one of the biggest steel distributors in the country, and I quickly fell in love with the industry. When you talk about fulfillment, it's really cool to see your input and the output it creates. And just in the physical world, you can drive around and see some of the products you've sold to manufacturers, whether it be trucks and beds and light posts and things like that. So it's super fulfilling, quickly fell in love with the industry. And 10 years later, here we are. As for the industry, I guess it's easy to break it down into kind of three verticals. There's going to be your steel mills who are producing the steel, whether it be flat bar, plates, tubes, pipes, whatever it is, coils. Then there's going to be the next vertical, will be steel distribution in the middle, who's buying the material from the mills at a wholesale cost, inventorying it, and running programs, things like that. And then there's going to be the end user, the manufacturer, buying material from the steel distributors in the middle. Estimate probably around 65 to 75% of material that the steel mills produce goes through distribution channels on through to its end user.
So to run it back a little bit, you mentioned that you started a career in the steel industry, and then that's what led you to found Emmett, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so we're in the studio here at the Capital Factory, which is an Austin, Texas-based incubator. Both of us are founders, CEOs of our own respective companies. So what is the problem that Emmett aims to solve in the spirit of entrepreneurship?
Definitely. So I think if you look at what manufacturers have been to, and even technology companies who are building technology for manufacturers, it's cobots, there's robots, there's sophisticated ERP systems, SaaS products now to do PO management and things like that. So manufacturers are innovating at a very fast rate. They're learning to do more with a lot less, and they're doing more with a lot less because of technology. You go downstream into steel distribution, that whole industry is kind of sitting there stagnant. I would even say it's a sitting duck. So me being in that industry, it was like perfect. There's a huge opportunity there to go and build products that would then filter upstream to manufacturers into the sophisticated technologies they're using. Cool, you have an ERP system. You have phenomenal manufacturing forecasting. How do we leverage that data? We need to go build technology now, the middle layer, the distribution layer, to leverage that technology, know what we need to buy, know how to service you guys, know how to run the right programs, know how to hedge. Maybe let's figure out, it's commodity. How do we buy futures to make your life a lot easier, save you costs in the long term, and kind of get into some.
Yeah, that is a lot. So where Emmett fits in then is the distribution portion of the supply chain, connecting directly to the buyers of steel for the manufacturing.
Exactly. We're buying steel from the steel mills at a wholesale cost. We're inventorying it in some capacity in a very different way. I'll tell you that. We're doing it in a very different way. And then we're selling the steel at what we deem a market rate to the manufacturers.
Okay. Well, that might be a little scary for some of our newer listeners to digest, but, we'll kind of break it down here going forward. So that being said, there are inefficiencies in distribution is what you're telling us, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's because the steel industry has lagged behind in adopting a digital solution for distribution.
Absolutely. I mean, companies doing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in revenue, even billions of dollars a year in revenue, using ERP systems that they themselves built 20 years ago. Just getting to the start line to digitization is a huge 3 to 5 year process. yet alone starting to add digitized value to manufacturers through supply chain automation and creative programs and leveraging technology that you can go out and build yourself.
Okay. So Emmett incorporates the existing technologies, builds upon them, but creates a more efficient platform to do so.
Well, no, we're building from the ground up.
Okay.
Yeah, we're saying we're going to go build our own internal mini micro ERP system. We're going to go build all the technologies ourselves, all the application to basically start fresh. Current distributors, if they want to replicate what we are doing, they essentially have to roll back every single ounce of their operation to then move forward with the model we're trying to bring to market that we believe is the future of distribution.
I like that. I like that. You know what? I love that. I don't know if you saw what I did there, but you said from the ground up, and that's the
Yeah.
name of this podcast. Okay. So, what sorts of problems exist in the steel industry that Emmett doesn't immediately address or specifically solve that you might say is on the horizon for us to look forward to?
Definitely. So I think right now we're largely focused with larger manufacturers, customers who are producing to a SKU. So you have like your OEMs, you have large contract manufacturers, things like that. That puts us in a position to leverage forecasts, kind of build out the supply chain. We like to joke with customers. We'll say, hey, what's your dream supply chain? We're going to go build it out for you. And oh, by the way, we're going to manage the whole thing through our platform, right? On the flip side, where we currently are not all that good is on smaller orders because you have to move smaller orders. It's hard to move 2 bars of aluminum. We can move a full truckload of aluminum all day, but moving 2 bars from point A to point B becomes a bigger problem for us because we're not currently geared to service smaller orders. So we do want to slowly, as we continue to scale, start servicing smaller manufacturers. But like in retrospect, I see why Elon Musk let him build a $250,000 car before he got to $30,000, right? And it's funny, hindsight's 2020. Now we kind of understand some of these things better as entrepreneurs, as we ran into the fire and then we came out to the other side and we learned a few things. And now I kind of identify what other people historically did it the way they did it. A lot more sense now that we've all got through it.
Between our two companies, TechChange Unbrokered is a platform that connects buyers and sellers directly, removing the brokers. That being said, Emmett is in the distribution side of things. What are your thoughts on this trend towards moving to direct approach in steel trading?
Definitely. So, I think we have brokers in our industry too. I think brokers in our industry are adding a layer to the equation. So B to B to B to B to B to B to B. So they're really, they're adding cost to the end user. They're adding probability of mistakes. There's a whole lot being added, and we just don't think it's a good layer. That being said, just because there hasn't been any innovation, these people who are kind of acting as the middle layer can sometimes go find something that somebody else, a buyer, somebody, the purchasing manager, supply chain team is having a hard time finding. So it's a double-edged sword. I think digitizing the whole procurement process eliminates a lot of the friction when it comes to finding hard objects or managing your supply chain just with your day-to-day stuff or hedging, import, domestic, things like that are common in our industry. I think over time, the need for brokers will go away. I think technology will solve some of the pain points that they are solving. I do not believe there's a place for brokers in the steel industry. It doesn't really make sense to me.
I agree. Brokers often, incur higher costs to cover their employees, through commission, volume-based commission, at least in these other industries that I work with. And as you mentioned, technology can substitute or be the alternative solution for brokers in their stead, cutting out those costs almost entirely. When I talk about costs, I'm not only thinking volume-based commission, I'm thinking the cost for the broker themselves, their salaries, their benefits, their packages, and that all gets passed on to the business, which is then passed on to the consumer at the end of that supply chain, whether it's a developer or something else.
Oh, for sure. You could even go as far as saying, like right now we're in an inflationary period. So having these extra variables added to the equation is actually perpetuating and almost compounding interest in certain areas, right? If something was going to cost $100 and somebody else needed to make their $15, $20 on top of that, well, now we just went up 15, 20%.
Yeah. Okay. So we've touched on this a little bit. How has Emmett's technology changed the way that steel is traded specifically?
Definitely. So I think when you look at the dynamics of the supply chain teams of manufacturers, you have like your engineering team, you have your planning team. So these guys are all working together to basically create the forecast and create the schedule that manufacturers literally load up their CNC machines or load up their fabrication shop or whatever it is they're doing, right? So you have all these layers and things might get lost in the shuffle. But also like look at a company like GM. I was just talking to GM the other day. I go, hey, how many supply chain coordinators do you guys have that are just checking in on where an order is? What's the status update? Where's the document? We lost the test report. Where do you get the test report? So digitization can eliminate whole layers of the cake on supply chain teams. And to the previous point, like we're all trying to do more with a lot less. So creating these infrastructures to cater to those environments, in our opinion, it's going to be a winning formula all around. So we're bringing like tremendous value, not just monetary savings. We're putting the power of the supply chain back in the manufacturer's hands. We're answering questions before they have to ask. We're giving them the info before they even know they need the information. And it's one step closer to supply chain automation. It's going to get one step closer to, hey, let's connect our system to a manufacturer's ERP system and just start porting documents over. Let's actually go and flip the procurement process and tell them when they need material rather than them having to come to us when they need material. A lot of things like that. Technology is in a position to kind of really radically change procurement.
Yeah, yeah. Those are, man, the more we talk about it, the more excited I get, because, you're talking about GM and tracking, and I'm thinking what we've been working on and overhauling some of our features and live tracking. And the technology really isn't that complicated. Once you get down to the development of it, it is actually deploying that and getting users to understand how to use such an easy technology or make it more user-friendly in our case.
Yeah, I think adoption's super important. I mean, without adoption, we're not going to survive, right? Realistically, like we're heavily dependent on adoption. And I think like user interfaces, ease of use, like one of my methodologies is like, could a kid go on our platform and have a pretty good understanding on like how to go find a piece of steel? That was literally one of the barometers we use for how our user interface works. So it's a little elementary, but I think it needs to be elementary before we start getting more and more sophisticated over time. I think part of the issue with technology in any industrial space is if you make it too complicated, no one's going to know how to use it. And people need to know how to use what you're doing. You cannot get to the end point without kind of taking the journey there. And I think part of the journey is to keep it super simple up front and kind of encourage adoption, show people how easy it is to use. I think realistically, industrial technology can be scary to people who've been working in these industries for 20 to 40 years, right? I think technology is a scary change at times. I mean, we're used to it. We grew up with Amazon, but like, why shouldn't manufacturers have the same luxuries we have buying a toothbrush on Amazon when it comes to buying mission critical metal or whatever it may be in the world we kind of live in?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. See, now I'm getting excited because I'm thinking, let's just get straight to business and work with the people we do business with very quickly, very efficiently.
I mean, and also like if you look at America as a country in the last 150 years, our sophisticated industrial footprint is what's basically kept us as like a superpower in the world, right? So I think now we're at this point where we need to re-industrialize at a very, very fast rate. And I think it's showing, right? You have a lot of VC dollars starting to go into industrials, which 5 years ago, I couldn't name a single industrial company that was getting VC money, right? But I think reindustrialization is very real. I think we need to learn how to manufacture quicker. And the way we're going to manufacture quicker is by digitizing and automating and all that stuff. When you look at what's happening on like a geopolitical basis, like other companies are subsidizing all the type of stuff that's expediting their manufacturing capabilities. Well, it's like, we need to catch up, right? I don't think we are anymore the superpower when it comes to manufacturing. We will catch up, but we are currently not in first place anymore, but we are well on our way to getting back.
That's a good segue. That reminds me of when I was an undergrad, I attended St. Edward's University across the river here in Austin, toppers up. And one of the classes I took was energy policy, taught by Dr. Peter Austin. I don't believe he teaches there anymore, but the core takeaway of that course was the true wealth and power of a nation is not necessarily the power of its military, but its ability to produce, to manufacture, to support that military, or to support the energy needed for those manufacturing facilities, to have that ability. That said, we're really seeing, I feel like in the last 10 years, the geopolitics of industry and competition, whether it's the trade war, which that kind of took off when I was an undergrad, or the CHIPS Act, relative policies, etc. And so of late, there's been a deal going on regarding U.S. steel. And, folks have been interviewing steel workers in Pittsburgh, and it's been mixed feelings. Now, for listeners who don't know what's going on right now, and Joey, jump in here at any time, U.S. Steel is negotiating or exploring a deal, I should say, to be acquired by a Japanese steel company. Now, that would take the company from the U.S. market and put it in the hands of the Japanese. And so I want to get your thoughts on that.
So there's already 26 steel mills in America that are owned by foreign entities. This isn't anything new, right? So my personal opinion is that this absolutely needs to go through. Nippon Steel has like 3,000 different manufacturing patents. They're willing to invest the money. If they don't invest the money, like U.S. Steel is going to cease to exist in a matter of years. Other mills will go and they'll buy the different idling mills for pennies on the dollar, right? So the deal's already been agreed to. I think now it's just going through the regulatory process. I think it's a lot of political finger pointing. You look at any other industry. I mean, you mentioned chips. We're in Austin right now. Samsung invested an insane amount of money in Austin to build a chip facility. You could easily argue that chips are a far greater national security threat than a piece of tubing coming off of a steel mill, right? So I'm kind of laughing because it is kind of a humorous thing that this has even become as big of a topic as it's become, because it seems so straightforward. I think most people on the steel production side and the steel consumption side are all pro Nippon and U.S. Steel, the deal going through, and them kind of going about their business. We will absolutely be in a position to increase capacity of steel production in America when this deal goes through. Like, we literally do not have enough capacity in America to produce steel for the demand side. We're importing material because we need to import material. We don't have enough material in America. So this will absolutely put us one step closer to meeting the demand with domestic material. Foreign ownership, I mean, in today's day and age, it's almost unavoidable at this point. America owns companies all across the world. Countries across the world own companies in America. I think that's part of just like where global trade routes have gone and just global dynamics and things like that, right? I think that's where allies come into place. And like, how many companies in America have offices in London and in Japan and all these different companies or all these different countries? I think that's just dynamics of the day and age we live in today.
I was listening to a podcast this morning, and there was one reporter who said, the politicians were in campaign season are romanticizing domestic manufacturing, using it to political ends, specifically this deal. And, keeping U.S. Steel in the U.S. versus working with our allies, which, again, as you pointed out, it's the way of the world. It's the way of the modern world. And with digitalization, we're only going to become more connected at longer distances in a faster amount of time.
Yeah, and I think like the name probably has a lot to do with it.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
I think the name has a lot. I think there's definitely a marketing element.
Yeah.
I think if it was just called like Kentucky Steel Company, I don't know if we'd be as up in arms about it too, right? I'd definitely be there's an element of marketing involved where it's like there's just like U.S. Steel. I don't think people even realize that like U.S. Steel is a company. I'm sure outside of the steel world or industrial world, people hear U.S. Steel, they just think steel produced in America, not a literal brand, not a literal stock ticker. Like, that is what it is. It's the name of the company, not the name of the industry. So, I mean, I think if you look at manufacturing, I think manufacturing is kind of a good barometer for where steel will end up going, right? If you look like the robots and the cobots and all that type of stuff, that's at this point pretty sophisticated and pretty rampant among like the mega manufacturers. Any OEM is going to have robots and cobots in their facility, again, to the trend of doing a lot more with less. So I think as you go further downstream, like this labor issue is very real. You go to the flyover states, which is where my industry exists. Like, I've spent time in every little corner of America that is not on a coastline. And these aren't towns where there's like a massive growing population, whereas people retire, there's going to be younger folks filling in those jobs, right? By default, you have to automate your operations. If you don't automate your operation, you're literally not going to have a human being in the facility to produce what needs to be produced or to move material from point A to point B or to palletize something or whatever it is. You're not going to be able to do it. And if you're not able to do it, you're going to go slower. You're going to lose your operational efficiencies. You're going to lose revenue. And over time, you're just going to cut, crash, and burn. Or a foreign entity is going to come in and they're going to buy you. But I think on the flip side of things too, I think like sustainability and a lot of that stuff too. When you look at the movement of material, like the steel mills are buying the ore. Okay, cool. The ore might be. Well, I guess there's EAF mills, and then there's like other mills like Cleveland-Cliffs buys a bunch of ore. They're not using EAFs yet, but like the literal moving of material from point A to point B. There's taking material off the trucks. There's putting it back on trucks. So how do we reduce the movement of material? You look at the existing distribution hub and spoke model. Well, hub and spoke model means material is going to move a bunch of times. Material is going to go from the steel mill to a hub, and then from a hub, it's going to get taken off of a truck, put on a new truck, and it's forklifts, it's consumable, there's manpower. All of this is getting rolled into the cost of the material, but also there's more truck miles being on the road. You might have a transfer route going from Chicago to Salt Lake City to LA. Meanwhile, that material came from like Birmingham, Alabama. That material has now pretty much accumulated to 3,000 miles of time on the road rather than just going from Birmingham, Alabama to LA, which is probably half of the distance, right? So I think those type of things add up when steel is one of the biggest commodities in the world. I mean, there's millions and millions of tons of steel getting moved, which means that each one of those tons is getting put on a truck and accumulating miles. So how do we reduce all that, right? Again, the steel mills are innovating. They're going with BAS. They're doing a lot of recyclables, but that's only one element of the whole supply chain as a whole. So I think that's going to be one of the areas that we are seeing some stuff, but we will see more stuff. And I think digitization will help a lot of that as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Last year, I attended the IHCC Business Summit in Chicago, and I got to meet with some recyclers out there based in Chicago, and it was quite fascinating because one of their biggest customers was actually Stillwater. I'm not sure if you recall, Stillwater is a water company, but instead of using bottles, they're using aluminum cans to bottle their water.
Yeah, I mean, steel is the most recyclable thing in the world. You can reuse steel over and over and over. You can melt it down and reuse it, melt it down and reuse it. It's never going to lose any of its properties of strength and all that.
So you ended that on strength, and I'm thinking back to your example of freight. So how could we ensure quality control? Because obviously in 3,000 miles, there's a lot of movement there and a lot of hands that could be touching on that steel. So how does Emmett ensure quality control?
So we're actually reducing miles and the hand getting put on steel every time it moves. Yeah, because of the way we're using 3PLs and different facilities and different methodologies to move and store material rather than relative to traditional distribution, we're probably reducing the miles put on a truck by, I would say, at least 40%. And We're never cross-docking. It's only one truck. There's never a cross-dock happening. We're not racking material at the same rate that a traditional distributor is. We're not moving material from one location to another. We're making sure the material goes to the location it's going to stay at before it goes to its customer or its home or wherever it's going to end up. I think those things you start compounding. They start compounding. You start with freight. You talk about the hands touching it. Well, the hands touching it are going to get reduced over time. So if we don't adapt now, we're going to have nobody to do these cross stocks anyway, based on the earlier conversation we were having, right? So I think once you start getting those things, and new opportunities will, I think for every door that closes, a new one will open up. I don't know what those doors are going to be yet. I think we're a little too early to be able to tell, but there will be new methodologies. And I wouldn't even be surprised if there's better usage, the railroads, if we had better technology to move steel on rail again. Rail is a quarter of the price of moving material on trucks, right? Maybe not as clean with the air.
Yeah.
I don't know. You might be able to speak a little bit more about that one.
Yes. You're talking about my preference for traveling by Amtrak across the country. But there are improvements that could be made with regard to steel, like sharing the railway with Amtrak. In my opinion, there should be separate rails for both. Whether that will happen, we'll see. That's its own politics.
Yeah, it's a tough one on that. Yeah. No, I mean, we in past employers, we used to use railroad every once in a while when we had more than enough time to account for the probability of mistakes happening. Or it's hard to track. You don't have the technology. You use Flexport to go ship something from India to America. You can follow your little ticker from the origin point all the way through the ocean, and you'll know exactly where it is, probably within an hour delay, very much. So we don't have that level of traceability with freight on rail. I think if we can accomplish something like that, hey, maybe the Flexport CEO is listening to this, maybe go create some technology to track railroad shipments. And I think that will create efficiencies as well. And then you can start integrating that into the platforms, into the ERP systems, and kind of create that level of transparency that just doesn't exist. But I think the lack of transparency prevents us from using things like rail right now on a more rapid basis.
To your point regarding railroads, you mentioned earlier that you're compounding the costs. And even in other industries, with each freight company, with each freight carrier, and they change hands, they add their own cost to that. And in some industries, it's the highest cost for our operations. So if we can have one carrier all the way through instead of exchanging so many hands, that's beneficial to the industry as a whole.
For sure. And I think if you look at where cities are around the country, most cities are realistically exist where they exist geographically because it was along a river or a railroad. Right. Most of the places we need to move things from already have that infrastructure built. It's a matter of how do we properly use that infrastructure? Because to your point, it will reduce the number of hands that have to take place. The team that gets put in place to get the steel from the mine to the mill, to the distributor, to the end user, there's hundreds of people that touch that transaction some way or another, and everybody has to eat at the end of the day. So those costs are going to add up. So how do you reduce the noise in between each one of those verticals as the
Exactly.
material goes from a mine at Copper Mountain
Yeah.
to the guy building the tubes that are lining, I guess, copper lines in electricity.
In Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, even like Chicago to down the Mississippi River, right? Like, why do we put things on barges for? It sounds
That's
so archaic to us, but it's archaic because we haven't learned to modernize these methods, right?
right. Right.
Like that's I wonder, women. I'm gonna go do a little detail for this. I'm genuinely curious now what the cost differences are between putting something on a barge versus having to trek something on road.
Right. Right. Yeah. Having taken that train from Chicago to Austin, it actually follows almost exactly along that
Yeah.
path. And to your point, one of the things that I find very insightful and that I like about the train is not only that I get to interact with Middle America, but the people who work in those existing mills, those existing refineries, the existing mines, because like you mentioned earlier, towns are built along where railways and rivers are. And because Amtrak and freight share the same railway, oftentimes you will pass by mills, refineries, mines, old shut down mines, and they're all along the sides of the railways that have their own little tracks where they stop, load material, and then get back on the track.
And then a lot of these steel mills have the track going through their facility, and they still use the tracks, but it's not nearly as much as it probably can be.
Right, right. Unless you're in Dallas, and every time I go to Dallas, it's always a delay because that's where it bottlenecks. So looking ahead, what are the benefits of greater transparency and collaboration in the steel industry?
So I think the transparency part is really important, right? Because right now, like there's very little transparency. Steel distributors are really secretive about like what material they have, and they're always going to protect their A customer. I mean, steel's a commodity at the end of the day. So when the price goes down, well, perfect. That means everyone can make a little more money. But when the price goes up and you're now sitting on low cost material, well, you're going to protect your A customer supply chain before you start protecting the new transactional customers that come off the road, right? So I think giving the views into inventory, giving transparency, things like that, I think will pay dividends over time too. I think it'll force distributors to be more competitive. I think it'll help foster the use of technology. I think it'll basically force people to start leveraging technology more and more when it comes to inventory management and things like that. So I think part of transparency will go a long way just in terms of like operating as better corporations and better companies as time goes on. Now, on the literal transparency side, with like the specs and documentation and things like that, it's really hard to get these documents. If every piece of steel, it's a test report. A test report is basically like a birth certificate for a piece of steel, and the steel is produced at the mill. The mill will cut a little piece off, they'll test it, they'll record the chemistry, the physical properties, and they'll create a test report, and that test report will follow on with that piece of steel. Well, like the test report goes in the back door of a building with a piece of steel, very rarely goes to the front. Most companies don't digitize their documents. So 2 years down the line, when somebody goes, hey, we need that test report, finding that thing is a huge, huge, huge challenge. So by digitizing all these, by pushing these documents directly into ERP system, I think that's going to help move people quicker. But also when you start adopting technology, cool, well, maybe we can start using the blockchain to move these documents from the mill to the distributor to the manufacturer. So when Ford Motor Company has a recall because of like a little clip, they can now only have to go recall 250 cars because those cars use that e-lock rather than 200,000 cars, right? I think that's where over time the use of technology and digitization will keep going downstream and it'll benefit the consumer. You and I who just go buy stuff off the street, I think that's where it'll pay dividends over time. And we have to start somewhere. I think this is where we start.
Oh, yeah. There's more to blockchain than just crypto for verification purposes and tracing materials quality down the line and who's accountable, who's liable for that if there are deficiencies, but also to recognize those who are doing a great job in quality control.
Actually, quality control is a great point, right? So if you're putting all these documents on a ledger and then there's a way to actually track the distributor, then go into the mill and say, hey, there was a discrepancy with the spec or it was at a tolerance or something like that. You can then actually start to take that data and identify which mills are producing at an exceptionally high rate and which mills are actually behind a little bit, right? That'd be a phenomenal tool to have because then when we as a distributor are buying and selling material, we know what mills to stay away from and what mills to use a lot more because it's going to lower the probability of issues further downstream with the customer And it also allows us to tell our customer, hey, this is what we are seeing. This is the data we have. I know this one might cost a couple cents more per pound, but when it comes to risk management, you're going to lower your risk a little bit downstream.
Definitely, definitely. And those are some insights we've been taking in as a company and developing technology to store information, not only transactional, but the material that's being transacted on in our blockchain. And that then we can feed into our risk management tools, particularly our AI insights. So they do have a lot of benefits for industry. It's adoption and then familiarizing the industry with these technologies that we could have work for us rather than paying somebody to do this.
Definitely. So, I mean, you're on the other side of the steel mill.
Yeah.
You're on the, I mean, you're literally on the other side of the steel mill. What's your take on the idea of adoption and having to almost like get to the start line before you can start building crazy technology? Have you seen kind of similar things to what I was mentioning before, or has your side have been a little easier with implementing technology?
I think in any hard industry, because we've met with folks from Invenergy to Rio Tinto to Caterpillar, Turner Construction, and down to the contractors, small and medium, because at the end of the day, the big companies depend on small and medium vendors, suppliers, but those contractors depend on the distributors like yourself for their materials. But downstream, still, it is a very analog process. And so that's where, TechChange and Broker, we were like, okay, so we're all having very similar problems throughout the supply chain at each point. So why don't we just develop a platform for us so that we have these tools so that we can cut out those brokers and then deal directly with you, or you guys can deal directly with contractors, and then you guys are able to actually work directly with each other, seeing the inefficiencies, seeing the risk, determining what time you should reorder materials rather than calling in asking at the last minute when you're like, oh my, it's time for another
you
batch.
want to be proactive, not reactive.
Right. I would say downstream, there's a lot of information because downstream in construction manufacturing, you have a lot of information of the market and demand. And that upstream is valuable so you can more accurately predict demand in that quarter or maybe in the year.
What's coming to mind when you say that too is like a lot of panic buying happens. And I think when you have the data and the information, you are then put in a position to not need to panic buy, because all panic buying does is raise the price across the board for everybody else. And that goes again downstream to you and I when we want to go buy a new roll cage for our Jeep or whatever it is. That roll cage is now $200 more than it was 8 months ago because a bunch of people went in panic buy. And the cost of steel skyrocketed over the course of 6 months. Like that happened during COVID. The price wasn't because of the true inflation. It was because people were going and buying 2 years worth of material and it created like an artificial demand. And now we're kind of back down to reality. But for a period, I mean, there's still probably big corporations, multi-billion-dollar a year corporations who are sitting on material they bought in 2021, late 2021, early 20, that they are now upside down on that they could have bought today for probably $700, $800 a ton less.
So what exciting developments do you see in the steel trade, and how might Emmett play a role in these developments, shaping the developments in its technology?
So our mission as a company is to help the re-industrialization. And I think like to us, it's like, how do we do that? It's like, well, we produce a product that lets manufacturers move faster, smarter, quicker, and more cost efficiently. So if those are our objectives, we need to then go build a company to achieve those objectives. I think our vision right now, I mean, we're an early stage startup, so we're crawling before we walk and walking before we run and running before we sprint. But we believe we're putting ourselves in a position to bring manufacturers monetary value, to bring manufacturers soft value. I think we can probably save manufacturers 15% between the cost of material and also the soft costs of digitizing all of their post-sale procurement processes, all of that type of stuff, right? That's the type of stuff we need to do in America if we want to stay the mega power of manufacturing as time goes on. Is it a huge vision? Absolutely. But I think if we don't have big visions, we're going to keep kind of moseying along using the same business model that we've been using for the last 50, 60 years, which is what's happened in my industry. So I think that's kind of the big vision. But I mean, we want to build towards supply chain automation. That is the goal. We believe the company should be able to leverage the data. They have an ERP system and to be able to take that data and go further downstream onto the more industrial side of it and just basically put them in a position to succeed quicker, faster, stronger, and all that.
How might listeners learn more about Emmett and the work that you're doing, whether they're interested in the steel industry or looking to do business with you?
Definitely. So if you're looking to do business with us, you can reach out on our website, emmetthq.com. That's EMMETHQ.com. And go sign up, create an account, start buying steel from day one. It's a pretty straightforward process. We're reducing the time it takes to buy material by like 80, 90%. Past that, you can find me on LinkedIn. Or if you want to link in the bottom of the podcast, and you're more than welcome to reach out. And I'm always happy to nerd out over steel and industrials and do exactly what you and I are doing today with strangers. I mean, I think the beauty of our industry is like everyone's nice. You call manufacturers, everyone answers the phone, asks how you're doing, you build relationships. And I just love meeting people.
Thank you for your insights, Joey. And listeners, as always, tune in, and we'll see you on the next episode of From the Ground Up.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.